In June 2025, President Donald Trump stunned North America by doubling tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, from 25% to 50%. This escalation targeted Canada, the U.S.'s largest supplier of both metals, and reignited a simmering trade conflict. The move sent Canadian industries into crisis mode, threatening tens of thousands of jobs and pushing companies to the brink. Many Canadians saw the tariffs as punitive, not protective, and feared a full-blown trade war. The North American economy, built on deeply integrated supply chains, now faced severe disruption. Trump's zero-sum approach ignored decades of mutual prosperity, risking economic pain on both sides of the border. As disbelief and anger spread across Canada, pressure mounted on the federal government to respond, either with retaliation or diplomacy. The stage was set for a high-stakes confrontation. Ontario Premier Doug Ford quickly became the loudest voice in Canada's response. He called for immediate dollar-for-dollar retaliation, matching the U.S. tariffs with 50% tariffs on American steel. Ford's tough talk resonated with workers and unions, demanding action to protect Canadian jobs. He also announced a plan to onshore manufacturing, aiming to shift production from the U.S. to Ontario and reduce reliance on American imports. Ford warned this could threaten thousands of U.S. jobs, turning economic pressure back on America. He hinted that everything is on the table, including Ontario's electricity exports, without making direct threats. Ford's aggressive stance made him a central figure in the dispute, capturing headlines and rallying public support. Yet, his rhetoric was as much about political posturing as policy. The national conversation was now defined by calls for strength and self-sufficiency. Despite Ford's fiery words, which made headlines across the country and captured the attention of both supporters and critics, his actions were ultimately more measured and calculated than his rhetoric suggested. Instead of launching an all-out economic offensive, Ford chose a path of symbolic protest and strategic planning. He ordered the removal of U.S. products like California wine and Kentucky bourbon from Ontario's LCBO shelves, a move that sent a clear message of protest, but was more about optics than inflicting real economic pain. The real focus, however, was on onshoring, strengthening Ontario's own industries and reducing reliance on American imports. Ford directed his government to identify U.S. steel imports that could be replaced by local production, encouraging Ontario businesses to invest in domestic manufacturing and supply chains. This long-term strategy aimed to insulate Ontario from future trade shocks, making the province more resilient in the face of unpredictable international disputes. Crucially, Ford did not impose tariffs or restrict electricity exports. Those powers belonged to the federal government, and he respected those constitutional boundaries. His recommendations were aimed at Ottawa, urging federal leaders to take a tougher stance, rather than acting unilaterally at the provincial level. Ford's approach balanced strong rhetoric with practical jurisdictional steps, ensuring Ontario's response was forceful but within the law. He coordinated with the federal government, pushing for a tougher stance while avoiding rogue escalation or actions that could backfire on Ontario's economy. The result: Ford was the loudest advocate for action, but his concrete moves stayed within provincial limits, focusing on unity and strategic protest. Ontario's response was assertive, but not reckless, demonstrating leadership while respecting the boundaries of provincial power. Social media quickly distorted Ford's actions, fueling rumors and misinformation. Online, Ford was portrayed as single-handedly waging economic war, imposing massive tariffs and closing the border to U.S. goods. In reality, only the federal government can set tariffs. Ford's calls were political, not legal. His "everything is on the table" remark was spun into false stories about cutting off electricity exports to New York. No such order was ever given, but viral posts blurred fact and fiction. These distortions fueled anti-American sentiment in Canada and anti-Canadian backlash in the U.S. The echo chamber made Ford seem more radical than he was, complicating diplomatic efforts. The gap between Ford's real actions and his online persona shows how easily complex events are twisted in the digital age. Public opinion was shaped as much by rumor as by reality. In contrast to Ford's fiery approach, Prime Minister Mark Carney's response to the U.S. tariffs was calm, deliberate, and highly strategic. Rather than reacting with anger or escalating tensions, Carney chose to project stability and control, reassuring both Canadians and international observers that the government would not be drawn into a reckless trade war. Carney condemned the U.S. tariffs as illegal and unjustified, but he was careful to avoid inflammatory language. His goal was to keep diplomatic channels open, signaling to Washington that Canada was willing to negotiate, but would not be intimidated. Ottawa decided to delay immediate retaliation, instead launching a series of intensive talks with U.S. officials. The hope was to persuade Washington to reverse course before the situation escalated further, and to demonstrate Canada's commitment to a rules-based international order. Canada already had counter-tariffs on $90 billion of U.S. goods from earlier disputes, so the government faced a difficult decision. Should they expand these measures or increase their severity? Every option carried risks for Canadian businesses and consumers. The federal approach was to balance strength with pragmatism. Carney's team worked closely with industry leaders, offering targeted exemptions to shield vulnerable sectors and small businesses from collateral damage, while still maintaining pressure on the U.S. Nearly 60% of affected U.S. imports were made eligible for relief, softening the blow at home and helping to prevent price spikes for Canadian families and companies. Carney's government had to project resolve and unity while also minimizing harm to ordinary Canadians. It was a delicate balancing act, requiring constant communication with the public and stakeholders. This careful, measured approach stood in sharp contrast to the aggressive rhetoric dominating headlines and social media, where calls for immediate retaliation were growing louder. Ottawa's strategy was to buy time for negotiation, not escalate blindly. The government believed that patience and persistence could yield a better outcome for Canadians in the long run. The federal response was measured, not weak, a demonstration of leadership under pressure, and a reminder that sometimes restraint is the strongest move a government can make. The tariff hike sent shockwaves through Canada's economy, threatening recession and spiking unemployment. Steel and aluminum industries faced existential threats with tens of thousands of jobs at risk and ripple effects across manufacturing and construction. Communities built on these sectors feared permanent decline. But the pain wasn't one-sided. U.S. manufacturers reliant on Canadian metals faced shortages and rising costs. Tariffs acted as a tax on American businesses and consumers, driving up prices for cars, appliances, and more. The integrated North American supply chain meant both countries suffered. Ford highlighted that previous tariffs had already raised U.S. product costs by 16%. The trade war was a lose-lose, harming workers and consumers on both sides. The trade dispute split Canada between calls for swift retaliation and urgent warnings of self-harm. The country found itself at a crossroads with passionate voices on both sides of the debate. Labor unions and opposition parties demanded immediate matching tariffs to defend Canadian jobs and show strength. They rallied supporters, insisting that Canada must not appear weak in the face of U.S. pressure. They argued that anything less would embolden the U.S., sending a message that Canada could be pushed around without consequence and devastate Canada's industrial base, risking the closure of factories and the loss of thousands of livelihoods across the country. Business groups and economists, however, urged caution, warning that counter-tariffs could backfire and create new problems for Canadian businesses. They pointed out that many Canadian manufacturers rely heavily on U.S. parts and materials, making them vulnerable to rising costs and supply disruptions. These experts feared job losses and inflation at home, arguing for targeted retaliation that would minimize harm to Canadian families and businesses. They advocated for diplomacy and carefully chosen measures, rather than an all-out trade war that could spiral out of control. The debate exposed the double-edged nature of tariffs. While they can punish foreign competitors, they also risk inflicting pain domestically, leading to higher prices and uncertainty for ordinary Canadians. Economists stress the risk of inflation, supply chain chaos, and the potential for long-term economic damage if the dispute escalated further. The Chamber of Commerce called for a strategic, surgical response, not blanket escalation, emphasizing the need for a plan that protected Canadian interests without worsening the situation. Canada, as the smaller economy, had to tread carefully, balancing the desire to stand up for itself with the reality of economic interdependence. The nation faced a stark choice: fight fire with fire and risk escalation, or seek a negotiated solution that could preserve both jobs and stability for the future. In this emotionally charged dispute, separating fact from rumor is crucial. Fact: Trump doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum in June 2025, triggering the crisis. Fact: Premier Ford called for matching tariffs and onshoring, and removed some U.S. products from LCBO shelves. Rumor: Ford unilaterally imposed tariffs or cut off electricity exports. False, as trade policy is federal jurisdiction. Rumor: the federal government did nothing. Also false. Carney's team maintained counter-tariffs and pursued diplomacy. Ford's soundbites spread quickly online, often stripped of context, fueling misinformation. The loudest voices shaped public perception, even when their powers were limited. The real story: Ford pushed for a tough stance provincially, while Ottawa managed the official response. Both levels reacted to the same crisis, but with different roles and tactics. Understanding this distinction is key to seeing through the noise. Canada now faces a pivotal moment, with the next federal move shaping the country's economic fate. Carney must choose between escalation, under pressure from Ford, unions, and opposition, or continued diplomacy. The outcome depends on back-channel talks with Washington. A breakthrough could avert further retaliation. For workers and businesses, anxiety is high as they brace for layoffs, stalled investment, and possible recession. Governments may need to expand aid for those caught in the crossfire. The dispute forces a rethinking of Canada-US economic ties and accelerates the push for onshoring and trade diversification. The era of seamless North American integration is under threat. True progress will come not from fiery speeches but from quiet negotiations and de-escalation. The well-being of millions depends on leaders stepping back from the brink and restoring cooperation.